Have you ever wondered what it would be like if Sonic the Archie comics met Image Comics Spawn? No? Well, I mean, that's too bad because that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. The issue here that we're looking at is Sonic Super Special number 7, and honestly, it's one of the most bizarre crossover comics I have ever read. Now, the story that I've always heard behind this is that Jim Valentino from Image Comics had sons who really liked Archie, and so he approached Archie Comics to work on a Sonic story for his sons. This was weirdly hard for me to actually fact check with any kind of credible source. There is this Google Doc document that I found that is apparently an interview with Ken Penders, which goes into exact detail on this story. However, I can't actually find where this interview is from because there's nothing in the Google Docs relating it to any actual interview, and when I tried to search stuff from the Google Docs, I couldn't really seem to find anything. Eventually, though, I found an explanation from Valentino himself in a CBR interview that seems to actually corroborate pretty well what was said in the Google Docs, so I guess the Google Docs is correct. Interestingly, the comic that would come from this was an Archie Image Comics crossover instead of it just being a Valentino Archie story that he wrote. And it was written by the guy who at the time was the head writer over at Archie, which was Ken Penders. We'll look at this a little more in detail later, but this would be Ken's first and only leap into his own Image comic. Now, even though this is a crossover between Archie Sonic and Image Comics, you wouldn't be able to tell that based on the start of this comic, because none of it has to do with Image Comics until honestly you're about a quarter of the way through the book. Instead, the comic focuses on this character, Particle. She's a young woman from the early 2000s that has what might honestly be the worst fashion sense. Particle has never appeared in any other form of media, regardless if it was Archie or Image Comics before this, so she is a brand new character that this comic introduced to us. After accidentally ending up in Sonic's world somehow, Sonic and friends would get ready to beat her up, and Antoine would show that he is an absolute creep with this line right here. Just let me throw on my French accent and I'll read it for you. She is an overlander, mon ami. Not only that, she's a female. One part ooh la la and two part treachery. Like what? It doesn't really matter what happens here with anyone because Particle would just zap them with some kind of device and it would knock them all out. She would then somehow teleport to the floating island, and it's here where she would find the Chaos Emerald. Ignore the mammoth in it, he's really not important for the story. Oh, and also Knuckles is here. But listen, Knuckles would be knocked out after a handshake, so he may as well not be here. After this, Particle would run away with the Chaos Emerald. Now, if we return to modern day Earth, or quote unquote modern day because it's now 20 years after the comic came out, we would learn that Particle is being interviewed by X-Files knockoffs Skulder and Mully. For the youths out there who have never watched X-Files, the main characters of that show are Mulder and Scully, so you see the funny joke there. Anyway, back on Mobius, Knuckles would almost drown due to the fact that the emerald went missing, and so his floating island would just become a normal island. And I'm sorry, I saw the photo. Why do they draw Knuckles like this? Like, early on, I don't know what was going on in Archie, but they made him glide like he was Christ the Redeemer, and it's so stupidly goofy because it looks like they've never played the game. I've never seen him fly like this anywhere other than Archie. Anyways, that aside, the gang would hunt down the emerald in a very silly looking car, and it's here that they would meet Spawn. Spawn, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly dark comic published by Image Comics. He's a character that's featured prominently on the cover of this comic book, and he's also found in some artwork found later in the comic. Now, despite being on the cover and having such a big presence inside of this splash art, these are the only two panels that Spawn actually shows up in, and he has one line of dialogue, and it is him saying no to Sonic asking him for help. That's it. First, I don't even understand why Spawn had to be in this comic, because it's not like children reading Sonic are going to have any strong attachments to Spawn, and so like, this just seems like a waste of time to have him there for a couple of seconds and then leave. I don't know, whatever. Our rodent friends from Mobius would then meet a kid who would offer to help them, and he and Sally would exchange this weird love eyes look. I'm not sure what was going on here.
This brings me back to you.
Back at his home, we would learn that this kid is actually the superhero Shadowhawk. I had to Google this, but he's another Image character, and I'm going to be honest with you, I really don't know a lot about Image Comics, so I'm not going to dive too deep into how these characters are represented in any way. Together, in the goofiest car imaginable, the gang would continue to travel until they reach Grand Central Station. Rotor, however, is an absolute psychopath, and so he teleports the car inside of this metro station. It's here that we would meet Savage Dragon. He's also an Image Comics character. But for some reason, and I have no idea why, here in Archie, everybody is drawn with like a Crimson Chin sized chin. Like it's bonkers that they're all drawn like this. They would honestly fit pretty well with that Ben 10 redesign, which I've never watched, but I have seen like that Alien X that has the big giant chin for some reason. Now, we're reminded that the gang is now inside of America because Savage Dragon here just starts blasting away at them at the moment they show up. However, this whole shooting incident gets brushed over pretty quick, and Shadowhawk and Savage Dragon then team up, and then they meet this other guy named Union, who is another superhero. If you're wondering why I'm glossing over all of this so fast, it's for two reasons. Like I said, I genuinely know very little about Image Comics, and therefore I know very little about any of these characters appearing, like most people who were probably reading this Sonic comic at the time. And number two is that this comic honestly takes no time to introduce anyone to the reader, so it's not like I'm actually glossing over anything, it just jumps from one thing to another really quick. Anyways, while Shadowhawk is out meeting his new superhero friends, the gang would teleport away onto a moving train, and it's here that we would meet this guy. Who is this guy? So like, if you know this story and you recognize this character, you know that this guy is Dr. Ian Droid. But for now, let's just focus on his name, which is Ian Droid, you know, because Ian Droid sounds like Android, like kind of. But the thing is, they never say his name in this comic. He's just some generic guy, and it's so bizarre. Like, that feels like very questionable writing. And what's interesting on top of this is that he's meant to actually be a much bigger antagonist than he is. When the characters meet Dr. Droid, he goes on to talk about how he and Sonic have already met in the past and how he's not met Knuckles yet, but he will meet him in the future. And it's like, what the heck is he going on about? It'll never be explained, ever. Not in this comic and not in like any future Sonic comic. So we'll get to that, but for now, let's continue the story. The supers would eventually rush into this train, tear off the roof, and everyone just starts blasting at the Emerald, which opens up a big portal and the gang gets yeeted through it. On the other side, we'd meet familiar faces. SWAT bots, or rather shadow SWAT bots, whatever. These SWAT bots come in and they get the gem. They also kidnap our Mobian and superhero team. And just a quick aside, once we arrive inside of Dr. Droid's prison, we see three silhouettes, and I want you to take a second to try and guess who they are. Like, seriously, just pause. I want you to tell me who all three of these characters are. So I'm sure that you recognize Batman and Spider-Man right away. I mean, they're iconic. But the third one really confused me when I read this. I couldn't figure out who it was at all. Like, I spent way too long looking at this thing, thinking of iconic comic characters, and ultimately I just thought that like it's a character from something that isn't Marvel or DC, and so I don't know it very well. And then also while looking at it, I was like, is that Donkey Kong? And I was like, maybe it's Donkey Kong. Maybe this is some weird reference to Donkey Kong. However, when I was looking through these pages again while writing this script, I think I've actually figured out who it's supposed to be, because again, I was looking at this and I was like, who has giant arms like this and a weird shaped head? And I was like, it's gotta be Donkey Kong. And then finally I was like, oh my god, this is Popeye the Sailor Man. You know, like one of the big comic greats. You've got Batman, you've got Spider-Man, and on the same level, you've got Popeye. I have no idea why he's included, but I'm like 90% sure now that it's Popeye and not Donkey Kong. Anyway, none of that's really important. In this prison, Particle would save a girl who we would later learn is her sister, but honestly, none of that is important because, I'm not joking, we are never going to see her again. And because it's been a while since another Image comic character has been introduced, the Max bursts in and Union busts out of prison. I don't know who any of these people are, but whatever. Velocity also shows up and Union starts saving people from their cells and Velocity goes to run with Sonic. I have no idea who any of these people are. What's going on? Together, the gang would fight Ian Droid, and after seeing his father in some weird spirit form, Knuckles would go on to do this? Yeah, your guess is as good as mine here. I don't know, this is when Knuckles was doing some weird chaos stuff, and the comics always just seem to be like purposefully kind of weird with him. But with that, everyone is back to where they should be. The Emerald is back to where it is. Particle lost her sister again. Dr. Droid is somewhere, I guess. And like I told you, nothing was really all that important. The sister is gone. The world has been reset. With that, Sonic and Tails are off zooming. Superheroes are holding hands. Tails has a comb over for some reason. And this was all a backdoor pilot into Ken Penders' Image comic. So yeah, Dr. Droid and Particle were Ken Penders' Penders characters that he had created for his comic that he was making for Image Comics that would later come out. It was called The Lost Ones, and this essentially all served as issue 0 of that story to set the ground. The Lost Ones, if you've never heard of it, only had one issue published by Image Comics, and then I guess due to poor sales, there was nothing after that. It had one issue and that was it. But despite that, there's a little bit more that we can say about this. So remember briefly how I touched on how weird Dr. Ian Droid was after he met Sonic and how he seemed to be way more than he actually was? It turns out that he was a weirdo because Ken Penders had planned for Dr. Ian Droid, and I kid you not, to be Dr. Robotnik secretly. Specifically, one of the Dr. Robotniks that we'd actually seen in another video. One of the Dr. Robotniks who appeared from another universe that was in Sonic Live, that weird Sonic comic that was also a one-off where Sonic abducts children into his TV world. Ultimately, this idea was scrapped by Ken Penders, but the original idea was to have him be another Robotnik from another universe who would also show up in Ken Penders' 20 Years Later arc, which would look at, obviously, Mobius 20 years later, where he would beat Knuckles before becoming Ian Droid. I'm gonna be real here. This kind of storytelling might be indicative as to why the Lost Ones never really made it that high off the ground. It's so bonkers. However, that would also mean that if the Lost Ones actually did happen and continued on with Ian Droid in it, Dr. Robotnik, or Eggman, or whatever you want to call him, would be in a comic book that didn't belong to IDW or to Archie, which is kind of crazy. And it's actually for a similar reason why this comic has never been republished, because there's crazy amounts of licensing going on with Image Comics characters showing up here just in absolute droves. With that, we finished yet another weird video exploring the honestly bizarre depths of the Sonic comics. I hope you enjoyed it, and honestly, if you did, I hope you leave it a like or you do any of that kind of stuff that people often ask for. Subscribers are always great, always welcome. Leave a comment if you liked it, if you disagreed with something. Let me know if I missed something, or if you actually enjoyed this comic, or if you disliked it, if you had heard about it before. I don't really care. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I just hope you had a good one.